All right, I want to welcome you to today's episode. Today, we're going to pick up on the parent alienation topic, but we're going to hear from a mediator and therapist on this perspective. I want to welcome Carol McKelvey to the program. Hi, Carol.
Good afternoon, Steve. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. Carol spent much of her career in behavioral health as a therapist and administrator, witnessing the deep impact of divorce and parent alienation on families, especially children. Seeking a proactive approach, she transitioned into coaching to guide individuals during divorce. Recognizing the need to work with both parents, Carol became a family mediator. For the past 3 years, she has focused on mediation, where she asks insightful questions to help families discover the best possible outcomes for all involved. Now, it's a pretty big step going from the therapy world into the divorce coach slash mediation world. What are some of the big motivations you had? What was the tipping point for you in your career to make that type of step?
I think that very often as a therapist, what I found was judges were very often ordering children into therapy for reunification therapy
Mm-hmm.
as a result of parents who were divorcing or divorced. And those children were very often the victims of parental alienation. And in order to try to help those um, families going back over and over again to court, the judges would say that they thought that the answer to the problem was reunification therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very well intentioned, not necessarily understanding that these children were still going back into that situation, not addressing the problem with the parents,
Right,
thinking they were targeting the child as having the problem,
right,
not
right. And
understanding what the real problem was.
maybe from a judge's perspective, they're not really equipped to diagnose this problem and then
Mhm.
offer a solution. They're not a medical professional, certainly somebody that's not certified in therapy. So that's kind of a tough position to be in, I think, if you're a judge.
I think it's a very difficult position to be in, and what you have in front of you is a child who appears to be not adjusting well to the divorce.
Hmm.
So it looks very legitimate. It looks like a very legitimate thing to recommend.
Hmm.
This poor little child is not doing well with this divorce.
Right,
So let's see what we can do to help this child.
right. Because doing nothing would be hard.
Sure,
Right.
absolutely, absolutely.
Well, you're handling both court-ordered and private mediations. And oftentimes, from my perspective, the court-ordered mediations tend to be more contentious divorces. How are elements of parent alienation present in your mediations? How often are you seeing it, et cetera?
I would say in court-ordered mediations, and sometimes in both, but in court-ordered mediations where there are children, when they have children, I would say probably close to 50% of those divorces. I also handle paternity cases as well. And I would say 50% of those cases, they come into the mediation with some level of parental alienation present.
Mhm.
And or some form of it's already beginning.
Okay.
Because it's already a contentious situation. There's already some form of conflict involved. And if they have children, they are already in that process.
Mhm.
So it can already have started then.
So are you saying that there's parent alienation that sometimes takes root once the divorce process starts? Somebody
Very
receives the
often.
news
Mhm.
that hey, my spouse wants a divorce, and then parent alienation starts.
Very often because one or the other party wasn't necessarily ready or expecting or didn't know this was coming. It comes as kind of a surprise. They're angry, disappointed, hurt, upset, whatever emotion comes with that. So they are trying desperately to hang on to something. And it may be that they sort of align themselves with their child. They want the child to be an ally and
Mhm.
inadvertently use that child as a way of, okay, I want you, I'm gonna align myself with you, and in doing so, I will make the other party the enemy.
Okay. What are the things that are triggering this? Like when you go through a divorce, you're following the process, and then your ex is starting, let's say, parent alienation attempts. What are the main triggers that you see?
I think it can be things like, depending on why the other party is asking for a divorce or wanting the divorce, if it's infidelity is a huge one.
Mhm.
Um, if the other party has become no longer attractive to this person, there's some
Mhm.
anger, disappointment, hurt there. If the reason for the divorce has to do with finances, there can be a lot of triggers like that. And those are really hard things for any party to get through. So
Mhm.
they need a place to put some of those feelings. And very often, unfortunately, they they find that if I can use my child, and sometimes it's almost not a mean or a bad intention. It's because if you love our child, you'll love me again.
Mm.
If I can, and it somehow turns into a very bad thing for them.
Right. Right. Well, when you mentioned finances, is it a situation where someone's trying to get a leg up to, let's say, cause the other one to have to pay more child support so that they
Often,
can afford their living situation?
very often, or somebody requests spousal support that the other person wasn't expecting, or the other thing that I see happen very often is the departing spouse didn't expect to be asked to pay child support.
Mhm.
Um, in paternity cases, what I really see is you have a child who is born to a couple. The couple weren't living together, or they did live together briefly, and suddenly the woman who has a child files for child support.
Mhm.
And the father says, "What? Wait, I thought you wanted to do this on your own. You never said you wanted child support." And then suddenly there's resentment on the part of the father. Um, and well, if you want child support, then here's what I want. And then they begin the back and forth.
Mhm.
Um, if you want child support, then I want this. And then she
Mhm.
says, well, then if you want that much, I want this much child. And then it goes back and forth, and then the child suddenly gets put in the middle of it.
Right. So when you're sitting there at the mediation phase, and
Hmm.
oftentimes a court ordered mediation is well into the divorce process, right?
Very, yes,
It's
absolutely.
sometimes I feel it's a little bit backwards because the process brews the contentiousness,
Mhm.
allows them to position, and they say, okay, now we got to settle things. Let's mediate. So oftentimes mediation is further along in the process, and this contentiousness tends to compound during that window. When this couple's falling into your services, how are you creating a shift or a reframing in their mind to say you need to stop this behavior or you need to step back or pause?
It's funny that you say that because I've often thought the same thing to myself. Why don't we do this so much earlier in the process before these people have had so much time to build so much momentum toward this anger and this hostility?
Mhm.
They're so far along. Um, I think that what you have to do is find ways to talk to them, and we often talk about this in mediation and building a bridge. Where do you find, what's the common ground here? Where can we build a bridge? And what do both of you want? What is the one thing both of you want? And can we
Mhm,
start there?
mhm,
And that's the one thing that I will often try to do with them.
mhm,
And sometimes, that's the hardest part, and it will take the longest part of a mediation to try to figure out what is the one thing both of them want. And I will very often, that's one of the first things that I ask in a mediation. What is the
mhm,
one thing you want to happen today? And I will
mhm.
ask both parties that
Right.
to try to build that common ground as quickly as possible, because you want to start working toward that common ground with both parties.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a similar exercise that I've used in the past, and this is for individuals who are preparing for mediation, but I would run them through a fast forwarding exercise.
Mm-hmm,
And the
mm-hmm.
exercise would have them envision some sort of future event, like a child's graduation. And I
Yes,
want for them to describe for me exactly what they want that day to be like, and get that set up in their mind before they start talking about mediation and their differences. And oftentimes they want the same things, but
yes,
they just having a hard time getting beyond the emotional blocks to communicate it right.
yes.
Right. And this point about the divorce process, and I anybody that's listening to this, I hope you understand that you can bring in a mediator at any point in your divorce process. But
Yeah,
oftentimes people are following the rules and saying, okay, well, the court will tell us when we need to mediate, or my attorney will tell us when we need to mediate. And oftentimes they don't realize that what's happening in that early stage of divorce, especially if you're working with litigator, is they're preparing your case for trial. They're not preparing your
exactly.
case for settlement,
That's
right?
right.
They prepare first for trial, then for settlement. That's why mediation is at the tail end of this.
Hmm.
So a lot of times you'll end up in a situation with these court ordered mediations. And I haven't worked on the court ordered mediation side, but oftentimes, and you can describe this for us, Carol, you're under a short window of time to
Very,
make
very.
your decisions.
Mhm.
And how is that healthy? I mean, how do you see that?
And you're so right about that. You're under, number one, a very short window of time, and number two, typically the court ordered mediations they're scheduled for very brief periods of time. Literally, you have a 3-hour time period to bring people to some kind of an agreement.
Hmm.
And very often that agreement will include their marital settlement agreement and their parenting plan.
Right,
Consider that for a moment.
right, right,
Two things, two major, major agreements in their lives have to be done in about 2.5 hours.
right. And if the contentiousness is sitting there brewing, somebody's going to waste a bunch of time trying to unload onto this situation some sort of anger or bitterness or whatever it may be.
And
Um,
exactly, you're spending the first half hour just trying to bring the temperature down in the room to a point where they can communicate in a meaningful way.
yeah. How much more effective do you think your mediations would be if people reached out to you earlier in the process?
I think it's a fine line, because there are some people who, if they come into mediation too early, they won't be able to do it.
Mhm,
They're too and I'm sure you know what I mean. It's
mhm,
too soon. They're too raw.
mhm,
They're too injured. They're too hurt.
mhm,
Um, and then they have to be able to get past that point, and then they'll be able to mobilize. Then they'll be able to move forward.
mhm,
And I think then they haven't really um, they haven't really thought through everything yet, and they're ready to go. They're ready to do that.
mhm. Yeah,
And mediation will be more meaningful to them.
right. I've often been a proponent of situations where if a couple has financial complexity that they don't understand fully,
Yes,
or if they have contentiousness that's built up, they need to pause.
yes,
Because proceeding through the process without those two things addressed will cause it to derail in many, many ways. And I often talk about the transitional phases with having a complete ending. And sometimes couples don't understand how to determine if they've completed their ending phase of their transition, which is their acceptance that the divorce
mhm,
is okay. So a question that I'll have them ask is, or answer is, can you say that the divorce is okay? And if
mhm,
somebody says, no way, it's not okay, then those are situations where you might need to pause before you went ahead and met with someone like a mediator, because all the reasons why you're saying it's not okay is the reasons that are going to keep you from having a productive mediation session.
correct. I agree. The other thing I think that's part of that, an important part of that is, are you ready to restructure your family?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
Is this a good time for you to begin thinking about that? Because if you're not able to get to that point, then you're not ready for mediation either.
That's a deep question.
Hmm.
What types of responses do you get when you ask that question?
It pauses people. It really pauses people because they really need to be, wow, wait a minute. How will I do that? Well, that's what we're here to talk about.
Hmm.
What do you want this to look like?
Right.
What do you want this new, your family is still a family. It will
Hmm.
just look different.
Hmm.
And you're in charge of what that will look like.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so many elements that come into that, because there could be the resistance of, no, I'm not ready to be a part-time parent, meaning that
Hmm.
I see my kids 26 weeks a year or something of that
Hmm.
nature, or I'm not ready to handle the financial obligations associated with kind of funding two households on our current income. There could be all sorts of things that come in and say, no, we're not ready to restructure this. But that's a very eye-opening question for them. Um, Now, if you ask someone that question and they said, no, we're not ready, what steps do you take? What would be your recommended course of action for that couple?
I think in that instance, I've actually had a couple who were not ready. They said no, no. And my next question to them is, what are you ready to do?
Hmm.
What are you ready to do? What can you do right now?
Hmm.
And they really sat for a while, talked, and that couple decided, and they had children.
Hmm.
Um, they decided that they came to the conclusion they were not ready to divorce,
Hmm.
that they didn't know that this was the right thing for them. And if it was the right thing, was this the right time? Because what they decided was that maybe they had moved to this decision to divorce too quickly.
Hmm.
Maybe they had been hasty. Maybe they thought divorce would be too easy.
Hmm.
And they decided they didn't want to do that. They thought maybe there might be another way. There should be something else that we should try first.
Hmm.
What happened was, um, they decided to try couples therapy.
Hmm.
They had some special issues. They lived in a relatively remote area. They had limited funds.
Hmm.
And what I ended up doing was, because of my connections in the behavioral health world, I gave them the names of 3 or 4 therapists who would see them with teletherapy,
Hmm.
and who were willing to see them on a sliding scale.
Hmm.
And that's what they ended up doing. And they did not divorce.
And that's great that you have that experience and those connections, because as I sit here and I'm learning more about you, if you just from a general perspective, if you're put on, if you have a therapist, the therapist is going to slow down the process, and they're going to guide the person through that therapy at a pace that they're comfortable with and helps them self-discover things. The therapists don't typically sit you down and say, well, we got a couple sessions to get it done and let's go, right?
Mhm,
Let's
mhm.
push through it. Where a typical mediator might be looking at saying, okay, well, our objective is to make sure we have agreement. And so someone coming in with your background with the therapy hat, you have uh, that viewpoint of slowing things down so that maybe they can get through the mediation more effectively. Am I reading that right?
I think that, as much as I like to get agreements, and I do, I do,
Mhm.
um, I think that my priority is what's best for the situation.
Mhm.
And I will often, if I feel that this is a situation where an agreement is not necessary, I will often say, how about if we do a continuation for mediation? How about if we hold this and say, you two sit and think about this for a month. If you want to come back to mediation in a month, you can agree to do that. You
Mhm.
do not have to agree today to an agreement. You can agree to wait a month and sit on this for a month.
Mhm.
And I've done that many times. You don't have to rush into this and feel compelled to make a decision today.
Right, right. Especially when it involves the children.
Exactly. Exactly.
Now, when we met during our first interaction, we had talked about, there's the obvious direct form of parent alienation, and then there's these subtle parent alienation attempts.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
one of the things that you mentioned to me is that parent alienation comes in all different forms. And I had written down that you said whenever there's a situation, for example, where a parent tells the children the other parent's approach is wrong, that is a form of parent alienation.
Hmm.
Can you help explain why, and then what other subtle types of parent alienation are people speaking or acting on that you may not think is parent alienation?
I think that people don't often think of, I think people, first of all, I'll back up. People think of yeah, parental alienation as the, parental alienation syndrome, where it's very overt, it's very clear. There's a lot of maligning of the other parent, there's name calling, it's very clear, it's very obvious, and there have been books written about it. It could not be more evident.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think there are much more subtle forms of it. And I think an example of that for me is when two parents have always done something a certain way. They separate, prepare for divorce, one child spending time with the other parent, and the child is, maybe a little anxious, not doing well with the separation. So the parent feels sort of badly, guilty, and says, you know what? You can go to bed a little later. It's okay. I understand. I
Mm-hmm.
understand. And then when that child goes back to the other parent and says, I want to go to bed at 10 o'clock instead of 9. No, your bedtime is 9. Well, when I go over there, I'm allowed to go to bed at 10 o'clock. Well, all the lights go off. What do you mean you go to bed at 10 o'clock?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm allowed to stay up until 10 o'clock on a school night when I'm there.
Mm-hmm.
So, this parent thinks, well, maybe it was a one-time thing, and then gets the message that it's happened 2 or 3 or 4 times and speaks to the other parent about it. Well, he's having a hard time. I let him go. Jack's a sensitive kid. I wish you wouldn't do that. That's not how we've always done it. We've always been on the same page about this. Please don't do that. But the
Mm-hmm.
pattern continues.
Yep.
It's very subtle. Doesn't look like a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know what? I'll have him go to bed at 9:30.
Yeah.
No, 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 no. So it's subtle. And now this child begins to understand I'm benefiting from this.
Mm-hmm.
Why would I not want it to continue? So it's all of it, very insidious, very subtle.
Mm-hmm.
And before you know it, you have two parents who are battling with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not the big name calling, but it's a very subtle, insidious form of alienation. One parent doing something that the other parent has specifically said, please don't do.
Oh yeah.
And those little kinds of things, or allowing, another example would be allowing a food that this child has never been allowed to have.
Mm-hmm.
Homework at a time before, screen times, those kinds of things that two parents have always agreed upon in the past,
Mm-hmm.
suddenly, it's that agreement has been nullified.
Yeah. I have a few I could add to that list based on conversations I've had with some of my clients, but an example would be, you know, the way your father is, or you know
Hmm.
how your father overreacts.
Exactly.
Or I've had a situation where one of the children started juuling and was hanging around this other teen that was introducing them, and the one parent said, I do not want the child hanging around anymore. Then the other parent would say, absolutely, I agree, but then turn around and allow the child to hang out with that other parent. And over time, that builds and builds and builds to the point where anytime that you're the parent that's, let's say, more strict, or the good cop or
Hmm.
the bad cop, then the children start to overtly um, disregard what you're telling them because the other parent has seeded in for so long that your opinion doesn't matter, or that you fly off the handle.
Absolutely, Steve. And you know what's worse? Don't tell your mom.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't
Don't
tell
tell
them
your dad.
that we did
This is
that.
just between us.
Right.
It's not most people think of it as the more sort of like, oh my God, you just called your mom a dirty name. It's not that bad. It's not that bad in the sense that these kids feel so torn, and so they just feel like, oh, okay, I'm benefiting from it. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not that bad.
Mm-hmm.
But it is nonetheless, it's it's parental alienation. It's just on a much different level.
Yeah, because it's cutting the legs out of the other parent. The other
Absolutely.
parent doesn't have a framework on which to stand, and they might be able to see their kids just as much, but it makes the whole parenting process so much more challenging when the kids are with that one parent.
Hmm.
Because, and the other thing that happens is when the kids are going back and forth on a schedule, say you're on a 2-2-5-5-2 schedule, and you have, the children are coming back from 5 days with the other parent. It might take you 2 to 3 days to get the kids back in alignment before they're off again. And
Hmm.
you're constantly on this hamster wheel of trying to get your kids to conform. And it's very stressful on the parent trying to make that work with all the other things that are going on.
So as a parent, you're spending all of your time with your child, trying to get them back into, whether it's a good eating schedule, a good study schedule, a good, routine of any kind. You spend all of your time working on that instead of quality time that you could be spending with your child.
Yeah, good point.
Instead of the good times, you don't have that. You don't have that quality time.
Right. And these are the types of things that you can't necessarily bring back up to the court and say, okay, Your Honor, well,
Mm-mm.
he's not following the parenting plan because he had said this, this, and this about me. How is the
Mhm.
court in a position to do that?
Mhm.
Um, I've often said that in a divorce, it's the parenting agreement that's the gray part. The finances are black and white. That'll be determined to the number,
Absolutely.
but the parenting part is gray.
Hmm.
Um, so let's say that I'm your client in mediation, and my wife is displaying signs of parent alienation. What can I do as your mediation client to better position my interest to you as the mediator instead of getting trapped in this toxic cycle or this argument trap that might be so tempting to dive into?
I think one of the first things that anybody who comes into mediation has to do, and this is one of the hardest things, is to be able to maintain the sort of the calm. And
Mhm.
that's hard because if you're coming into mediation and you're trapped in that sort of the cycle that you just described, um, it's very difficult to maintain that level because you know what's happening. You know that you're being sort of challenged as a parent, for lack of a better term, with regard to how, everything is being undermined. That
Mhm.
your expectations as far as a parent are being undermined by the other parent. Um, so it can be challenging because you'd like to be respected. You'd like to have your expectations respected.
Mhm.
And they're not, and you know it.
Mhm.
It's frustrating. It's disappointing. It's annoying. It's all those things.
Right.
So it's hard to remain calm. I always have, I think it's important to kind of keep track of the times that those things that you expected or the things that you, as parents, when you were together, were outlined. When those things were set aside, whether it's, by way of a text or an email or times that your child may have said something to you,
Mhm.
um, keep good notes, keep track of those things. Um, Make sure that you're really making an effort to try to keep those things in line. And when they aren't, or when your child tells you that this wasn't done or this wasn't complied with, um, and then when you present that information, to present that information in the most um, factual way possible,
Mhm.
with as little, and this is the hard part, little emotion as possible.
Yeah, as little judgments
Exactly,
towards the
exactly. Most
situation.
objective way possible because you need to be able to maintain that objectivity and that sort of this is what's happened. I'm not telling out of any vengeance or anything like that. I'm telling this information to the mediator because I think it's important for the mediator to understand this is factually what's happening.
Right. So yeah, it's that frustration builds up, and the other parent might say, well, the children need to be with me because he's verbally abusive to the
Yeah.
children. He flies off the handle. He's angry, and then all of a
Hmm.
sudden he's shouting, "I'm not angry. I don't have to say
Exactly.
something."
That's exactly
And
right.
then you, as the
No,
mediator, is trying to say, well, is she right or is he right? How do you know? So always trying to keep your best self and your composure. And I like to run an exercise with people I'm preparing for mediation through coaching, is to say, I want you to visualize what the mediation day is going to look like. And what are things that you think is going to come up and how are you going to respond?
hmm
You know,
hmm
and how do you process it as, oh, here it is again. This is what I'm going to do.
hmm
To try to keep yourself in a higher self, because you don't want to put your energy on display to further support what the other's claims against you are.
And I think that that's an excellent exercise. And then sort of as a coach, what is the thing, sort of create that hierarchy? What is the thing that will anger you the most? What is it?
Mhm.
Then the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and sort of build that. And how will you respond? How will you respond? Prepare yourself for those things
Right.
because each and every one of them could and likely will happen.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
here, listen to it because it could happen. It will happen.
Well, now that we're talking about energy, we can wrap up with this idea. I mean, one question I have is whether or not your legal counsel should be present during mediation. And I guess there's advantages and disadvantages to each, and each situation is a little bit different. But can you explain how the energy of the parties tends to differ when their legal counsel is and is not present? And as the mediator, how do you bring harmony when the energy is drifting into this more negative realm?
Mhm. I think one of the most important things that you can do when it happens is to remind everybody in the room, we are not litigating, we are mediating. This is not the courtroom. No, there's no judge here. So we're talking. We're not, that's the purpose of what we're doing here. We're trying to work toward an agreement. And that's, I think, the one thing that very often, when there are attorneys in the room, people can lose sight of that.
Mhm.
Attorneys are very comfortable in that courtroom environment. So one of the things that can kind of help is if you kind of keep bringing them back to that. I've worked with attorneys who are absolutely wonderful, who are fantastic, who are very comfortable in the mediation environment. Some of them have to be reminded constantly, this is a mediation, this is my room, not your room. Let's keep that in mind. And others who are, very comfortable with the idea of mediation and who want to work with their clients. I've worked with others who really want to try to come to an agreement. And they really don't want to they want to keep the temperature down.
Right.
They are very good at having their clients work toward an agreement. They're good with explaining things to their clients. I've had other ones who I've finished my opening statement, and the first things they will say to me is, "This is an impasse. I won't waste your time." And they've done it in every single mediation I've worked with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen situations where you have a very aggressive attorney
Mhm,
that is comes into the mediation. They're asking for the world for
mhm,
their clients, and of course, it's absolutely unreasonable. But it's purely there to drive the mediation opportunity away so that they can take
mhm.
the case to court. And
Absolutely.
I just wish people would be smart enough to see and read through some of what's happening here.
And I'm sure you've seen attorneys who really want to go to court
Hmm.
because it will mean more billable hours for them, and they're okay with that,
Hmm.
which is unfortunate. And then
Right.
there are others who really are not, they want what's best for their client. And
Hmm.
that's all they care about is what is best for this client.
Right. Well, Carol, I want to thank you for attending today and sharing this valuable perspective. Real quick, can you just share with us where you're located and the best method for someone to reach you if they're interested?
You can, my website is www.findingyoursolutions.org. I'll be happy to, anytime anybody needs any kind of information, I'd be happy to talk with them. I'm
Okay.
certified in Florida and in New York.
Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you again, Carol. I wish you well in your practice. And again, I appreciate your perspective.